Hey everyone, back again. All right. I hope that wasn't too loud. I feel like I came in hot there. Let us jump into or finish off Cedric Marxism, Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, and we're gonna just cover part 3, titled Black Radicalism and Marxist Theory. If you're just jumping into this, go check out the first 2 parts. What are you doing? Please get it right. And yeah, let's just jump right into it. Don't waste your time. Starting with chapter 8, because that's where we are. Chapter 8 of the whole book. The formation of an intelligentsia. And here in this part, we're going to talk about the role of nationalism, the various different internationals of Marxist movements, from the First International all the way to the Fourth, First International, the mid-19th century. So we're expanding about 100 years of history. First International, should have remembered this. It started in about the 1860s. Marx and Engels started the First International communist movement. And it would take on many different forms, all the way up through Lenin in the mid-20th century and Stalin mid-20th century. So we're talking about 100 years here of movement, and the connection between the thought that went on within the various different internationals and its relationship to the Black radical tradition. Now, after looking at that, we're going to look at some different figures within the Black radical tradition, including W.E.B, Bois, CLR James, and Richard Wright, including others, which I have some thoughts about. I think that it's really interesting that Robinson chose these 3 figures as being emblematic of the Black radical tradition, seeing as they were, like, except for Richard Wright, and he acknowledges this, but I'm like, you could have chosen so many different people. Like, what about the history of, like, any of the resistance movements in Africa, like the Mau Mau, or Algerian anti-colonial struggles, just me. But yeah, so let's jump into this. Part 8, or chapter 8, sorry. So one of the consequences of the erasure of these histories of the Black radical tradition that we talked about last time has been to abstract 19th and 20th century Black radical thinkers from these histories, making of them only the consequence of white forms of resistance at the time. So this is often the case. Like, even somebody commented, they're like, you're going to say this? You're going to deny the history of Marxist thought among many different Black intellectuals and many different Black resistance thinkers? And why are so many different resistance thinkers all over the world and activists, why are they Marxists? And it's like, are we really going to... Yeah, many of them are Marxists because they recognize that that's part of the struggle. But are we really going to reduce what they're doing to their Marxist inclinations? Like, what the hell? Like, come on, there's clearly so much more motivating them than them being informed by Marxism. And this is just an effort to, like, suggest that the only way they could have had this critical resistive consciousness is by adopting this European framework. Like, that's the only way. Like, what? It's absurd. And the same applies to so many other contexts, like where any kind of resistance has to be, like, approved with the right Marxist approach or something. Or, if there's any kind of resistance, the Marxists are like, oh, this is just the latent, even if they don't recognize it, it's a latent expression of anti-capitalist Marxist impulse, as though there could be no other reason for it. Especially, and one of the easiest ways I like to think about it is in terms of, like, sexism, where women fighting against patriarchy don't necessarily need to do so by also doing so through the filter of Marxist struggle. Many of them do, and I think that those are some of the most vibrant, important feminist struggles, but it's not the only motivating factor. Like, fighting against sexual aggression and violence is something that transcends capitalist exploitation. These things are intimately connected, obviously, but it can't be reduced to it. And I'm always just shocked when Marxists are incapable of holding this nuance that both things can be true. And it's like, for many of them, if you acknowledge that that's a possibility, that maybe there are other motivations, then you're branded as reactionary, or you haven't, like, properly understood Marxist doctrine or something, which I always find really interesting. But yeah, that's just me. But this will be relevant as we look at W.B. Du Bois and CLR James, especially later on, because they were like middle class black intellectuals that came from, fairly good families, like wealthy families, I mean, had the opportunity to go to school and study European knowledge systems and all that. And so Robinson will use them to say, like, look, these people adopted, and many of them identified for a period as Marxists, but then recognized the limitations of Marxist thought when accounting for the specific struggles of black people, which has historically really been ignored within the history of Marxism. Like, and that is definitely a hill I think I'm really willing to die on, is that Marxism, this has been really an area that's been ignored within Marxist thought. Or ignored is not the right way to put it, but when it has been accounted for, which it is accounted for, it's just like often without actually listening to black people and their struggles, and has been about imposing this Marxist narrative onto them and saying, like, we know the solution for you, we'll just adopt this and everything will fall into place. That puts us into chapter 9, Historiography and the Black Radical Tradition. W.B. Du Bois, So we're going to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was obviously one of the most important intellectuals, historiographers, and Marxists in the 19th and 20th centuries. Where Du Bois, he was the first black man to earn a degree, his PhD from Harvard, and to work at Harvard. So I think that he was the first to do both. Now, during his life, he wasn't really celebrated by his peers because, surprise, surprise, racism. At least not celebrated like white intellectuals at the time, unless it was about his contributions to like black historiography or black history, which is often and Audre Lorde writes about this in Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools. She writes about the way, like, what kind of motivated her to write this book. She starts out by writing about this conference she was attending where she was placed into a panel of just like black people, as though they're just going to talk about black things, and then all the rest of the conference, where it's like talking about philosophy or talking about other things, like what is assumed is that those spaces are like white, but then any talk of blackness is like its own thing. It has to be, and then that's what black people do. Same thing with like feminism, where it's like women's knowledge is often through like white philosophy bro dudes. It's seen as being like specific to women, whereas white philosophy bro dude knowledge is like universal. It's applied to everyone. Like Hegel is for everybody, whereas like Simone de Beauvoir, for example, is just like something for women. This kind of thing. But Du Bois wasn't like perfect, obviously. I mean, one of his more problematic ideas, I would say, is the idea of the talented 10th. And that is the idea he believed that black people didn't have enough. They weren't like organized enough. They didn't have the right level of knowledge, if that's the way to put it. And he believed that there needed to be like a contingent of enlightened and educated black people to like guide the rest of black people. And yeah, it's like, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. That's an idea I think later in his life he would push back against, and he would revise a little bit, because it wasn't really, it was kind of not great. And so in the late 19th century, Du Bois's views more closely resembled like those of the middle class kind of intelligentsia views that harbored some oppressive ideas, like this idea of the talented 10th, that weren't really speaking to black people as black people, and recognizing that regardless of their adherence to European knowledge systems, still possess the capacity for resistance and historical consciousness. Of course, like you don't need to go through the filter of the European school system to have these kinds of knowledges, even though that's what he was kind of believing at the time. Now, his views started to change in the early 20th century, where he started to acknowledge the importance of class analysis, of which, so he would implicate himself and recognize this in his own place. class analysis and understanding how these things connected. He would join the communists, but ultimately he would find himself to be kind of disappointed with the communists for ignoring the problems that had beset mass movements bringing together whites and blacks. Where, in Cedric Robinson's words, the labor movement was most often at best ambivalent towards black liberation and progress, or it viewed or tried to subsume black liberation and progress under the umbrella of Marxist movements, of Marxist resistance. Now, one of Du Bois's sins for many Marxists was approaching Marx through Marx, which I'm a big fan of. I think that Marx is great, and I think that we find in Marx that Marx was a lot more humble in his views than I think that some people like to caricature him about, or what he was on about. And I think that he leaves a lot more room for negotiation and understanding and like disagreement than I think some Marxists in trying to put his ideas into practice. Very importantly, though, I mean, they're responding to a very serious threat in terms of capitalist exploitation. But it's really important that I think that, like, you know, reading Marx, I think is really important. And so, Du Bois did the same thing. Instead of going through Trotsky or Lenin or anyone else like that, he was reading Marx and trying to understand what Marxism was like. And so he had a kind of ambiguous relationship with the various different Marxist internationals, which kind of coincided with his life, like kind of the same period, where the first international would take place. I did write it down before. I'm like, when was it? Yeah, the mid 1860s. First international took place for about 10 years between 1864 and 1876. It was founded in part by Marx to propose international workers' movement unencumbered by nationalism, hierarchy, and so on. The Second International would take place in 1889. From about 1889 to 1919, it was founded with Engels. Engels founded it with Lenin, Luxemburg, and it took a bit more of a cosmopolitan and anti-imperialist, anti-war stance, and it would end with World War I, where World War I splintered the movement because many of its members chose nation over the working class. And this was one of the problems that the internationals confronted, is that through the various world wars and various other conflicts, it forced people to readopt and to really lean into nationalism that the internationals were trying to oppose. Because after all, the communist idea is like workers of the world unite. It's not workers of this nation unite. In fact, it's like the end goal of capitalism, or the end goal of Marxism in the end of capitalism, is having a world system predicated on a united workers' movement. Not to have just like one workers' movement, one place, even though that's perhaps how it has to start. Then there was the Third International, took place between about 1919 and 1943. It was Lenin-led Bolshevism, and its decline began in 1924 with Lenin's death. It's more or less its decline began, but then it would continue on for like 20 years. Wasn't much of a decline, not really. There's also like, the Fourth International was at like Trotsky, taking place at like the end of the 30s, because there's like a lot of disagreements here. Also a sign that socialism and communism are not these perfectly agreed upon systems. Like even within the internationals, there was a lot of disagreement about what it looked like, which is important. I think these conversations are really important to have. But that's why it's always like so interesting to me when socialists are like mounting criticisms of like this book, Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, as though they're implying that their own approach is this like perfectly consistent, unchanging, universal, totally agreed upon thing, when it isn't. Like it absolutely isn't. So some of the issues that like Du Bois would have, and then CLR James and Richard Wright would have with the internationals, with Lenin, is that the Bolsheviks, for all their good, they harbored the belief that like they would be the ones to steer minority populations in their own struggles, because Lenin was obviously recognized that not everything was just simply reducible to capitalist exploitation. Lenin was smart. He recognized that there are other factors at play, but still, like, it would have to go through the filter of Bolshevik ideological understandings in order for these people, any minority population, to actually oppose their oppression. And I think I mentioned the case of China in the first episode, but like one of my colleagues had told me about this history of China where, I'll mention it again in case you've forgotten, but like when the Cultural Revolution took place in China, the Mao's government, they were like, okay, well, let's do a tally of all the minority populations. And they did, and they found there was like hundreds and hundreds of them. And the government was like, whoa, it's way too many. Collapse a bunch of them into non-existent broader categories, like the Uyghur people, for example, which didn't exist. I mean, it's many different communities, many different peoples and languages that were then just like collapsed under this one umbrella term because the communists were like, we can't deal with all these different minorities, their struggle, whatever. We're just going to clump them onto these, which did a lot of violence, even though they, trying to be generous to them. They were trying to do good. And it did this kind of violence. But what it did was effectively like take these people away from their own selves. It alienated them from their own communities in favor of pushing them into like suggesting that their struggle is just like a Marxist struggle, which wasn't always the case. And so that, like, because many of them had no attachment to capitalism. These were like rural Chinese peasants and farmers. Like, no capitalism within 1,000 miles. Like, none of that. And so, but suddenly they're actually the ones being oppressed by the communists coming in and telling them what communities they're part of, because it's about an organizational logic that is enacting these Marxist efforts to coordinate the population towards this communist goal, which of course is a very good and important one, but without it being properly, it should be interrogated a little bit so that it doesn't repeat the same violences or similar violences that it's trying to oppose. So to go back to the international movements, and we're only scratching the surface here, obviously, I can't get into the whole history of them because that would take forever. But this movement largely commanded the anti-imperial and anti-capitalist struggles. Therefore, they were largely anti-nationalist. Now, this would take on different forms with different people. Stalin would have a different view of nationalism, definitely from Trotsky, definitely from Luxemburg. Luxemburg, she was very much anti-national, whereas someone like Stalin was like, what other tool do we have at our disposal to put together a communist class? I'll just use that word. Maybe that's the wrong word. Put together a communist effort that is actually viable and will actually be able to protect itself from capitalist influence. But overall, the internationals were opposed to nationalist movements. So when black people, especially with figures like Malcolm X, although I didn't look into the history of Malcolm X's relationship with the internationals or with the American communists, which I should have, but fill it in the comments if you'd like to, if you know something about that. But with people like Malcolm X who are calling for a kind of black nationalism, black return to Africa, or actual black reparations and black nationhood within the U.S., what he's effectively doing, and he was met, or not he, but those ideas were met with a lot of resistance from the internationals that saw them as being reactionary, or being traitorous against the communist movement because it was national and not international. But that's because for black people, having a nation where they are protected from white supremacy, protected from European colonialism, is the end point of their historical consciousness. Or not the end point, but is one destination on the path of historical consciousness for them in opposing the historical oppressions they've experienced. And for them, it's not reducible to just capitalist exploitation. And this tension was found even within or among different black groups, black resistance groups. So, for example, the UNIA under Marcus Garvey believed very much in African return, whereas the African Blood Brotherhood believed in making life livable for black people in America through various resistance efforts. And there were disagreements here, very much disagreements. And this is, of course, these disagreements are really important. It's very important because it shows the stakes and it offers many different ideas and ideally comes together in terms of a mutual recognition of the horrors of white supremacy, of European colonialism, and imagining futures away from these systems and making reparations for the past. It's not just about the future, but also remedying as best as possible the harms of the past. So the African Blood Brotherhood would develop strong alliances with the American communists in their mutual opposition to nationalism, whereas the UNIA would have with Marcus Garvey would be kind of didn't have a great relationship with the communists. They would, it depends on some things they would, but they didn't have a great relationship with the communists. And Garvey has often been really been dragged through the mud, obviously. But in any case, it does show that this isn't a homogenous movement, and is a sign of these vibrant discussions taking on their own forms along the continuum of the Black radical tradition. So obviously, though, in all of this, Du Bois, he valued Marx, he valued Lenin, but didn't want to lionize or idolize them. He recognized they're only one piece, small pieces of a bigger puzzle. And this is especially true when looking at anti-colonial struggles that are not totally directed at capitalism, obviously. These resistances were primarily conducted by the peasantry, not the kind of canonically enlightened proletariat. And this is something that Foucault writes about a little bit, actually, where Foucault in his lectures writes a lot about various different peasant revolts that were revolting against different kinds of economic exploitations and were actually pushing for different kinds of economic systems and different kinds of economic arrangements that didn't really follow the trajectory of capitalist and then communist development as Marx had laid it out. But these histories by Marxists have often just been reduced to another kind of historical expression of a latent kind of Marxist, anti-capitalist, anti-economic exploitation without really getting at the nuance of what they were doing and what they were opposing. And the working class is obviously, there's a vibrant history of working class resistance through, unions maybe aren't the best example, but many of the resistances that we've seen have not come from the enlightened industrialized working class, which is what Marx kind of predicted. Really, the resistances have come from people who Marx would have viewed as being still kind of infantile in human history, be it peasant workers in Europe or people speaking to and enacting the Black radical tradition that Marx had a pretty negative view of. But in any case, it shows the extent to which these different kinds of resistances took on different forms. Putting us here into Chapter 10, CLR James and the Black radical tradition. So CLR James, he lived from pretty much throughout the 20th century. He was born in 1901 until 1989. And he was a Trinidadian Marxist Trotskyist, anti-racist, anti-colonial activist, and writer. Now, Trinidad's history of enslavement is very complicated, obviously, as histories of enslavement are incredibly complicated, or Trinidad and Tobago. Technically, it ended in the 1830s, but that just pushed the people there into a new kind of exploitation. And this is very much the case, too, with the ending of the quote-unquote ending of enslavement in the U.S., where it just entered these people into a new kind of exploitation, into wage labor exploitation, which when you factor in racism meant that they were being paid even less than their white wage-earning counterparts. And this created a lot of animosity. And I'm reading another book now that I'm going to cover in more detail, and I think I might have the host on, or the writer on, Yoon Song Kim, who writes about the Homestead strike in 1892, which was a steel workers' strike. And during the steel workers' strike, this is 1892, as with many strikes, the owners hired scab workers, quote unquote scab workers, people who are going to break the picket line. And many of them were black, because many black people were on the verge of death because they needed to work. And what this did is it created a lot of animosity and really fed into a lot of racist ideas among unionized steelworkers against black people, because unions were highly segregated at the time. And so with this is these people, the steelworkers, actually started to harbor more anger towards black workers than their bourgeois exploiters, who are the real enemies at the end of the day. But without actually accounting for this, it just fuels kind of racist separations even among workers. And so the idea that just like workers of the world unite, it's like, wait, are we really not going to account for how, believe it or not, workers might also be racist? Are we just going to pretend that's not the case? We're just going to pretend everyone's going to come together and it's all going to be great? Like as though these racist ideas and embodied feelings are just going to go away? I mean, it seems incredibly naive. But yeah, back to Trinidad and Tobago, where it's after enslavement had ended, it pushed people into a new kind of exploitation with capitalism. Hence, still the importance of Marxism in accounting for this. So many refused to work for obvious reasons, and so sugar plantation owners pursued labor from elsewhere, to import from elsewhere, from China, India, the U.S., other South Central American countries. And so you saw this influx of workers from all these different places to do this kind of work, this cheap labor, because newly quote unquote freed black people in Trinidad and Tobago weren't going to be super willing and weren't willing to then step into a new kind of exploited work. So hence there was a lot of cultural and linguistic exchange, for better or worse, really. So like, for example, as a result, many laws emerged to suppress Creole and other patois languages and cultures, like carnival, like festivals that were very much a part of these kind of these black traditions in these areas. It extends outside of Trinidad and Tobago as well, though. But what was seen then was the adoption of various laws to suppress Creole, black, patois, or I guess patois. The term might be a little problematic, but all these different languages and ideas and cultural activities in order to try and like suppress the sign of people living a life that doesn't comply with wage labor, where these people are just straight up just refusing it. Whereas Marx is like, oh, capitalism is a totalizing system. It's going to subject everybody to this, take away their knowledges and stuff, for having their own cultures and lives, et cetera, et cetera. And these people they were like, screw that. I'm not doing that. We're going to live on our own. Like in the last episode when we mentioned the history of like the maroon settlements, where people were like, I'm not submitting to this capitalist system. I don't care how much Marx thinks that this is necessary. We're going to go live our own lives the way we want to, which is great. And so the British really took it upon themselves to try to anglicize these people, because this is how colonialism works, right? It strikes at the heart of people's language and cultures, tries to remove their languages and cultures so that they are alienated from themselves. Again, another example of alienation that isn't just economic or capitalist exploitation and alienation. And so, as many colonizers do, the English made it so that the recognition of humanity among these people was dependent on their adopting English and adopting English culture and attitudes and everything. And there's a quote from Fanon where he writes that, almost verbatim, he's like, black people become human in proportion to them adopting like white language and white cultures. And it's like, yeah, they're then recognized as having some potential of being human, which isn't to say that if black people then just adopt white cultures and white languages, then no one will be racist towards them. In fact, the opposite. But they'll at least be able to be recognized or seen as being human, he's arguing. Now, CLR James was one such person who adopted colonial language and knowledge to turn it back, though, against the colonizer, very much like Frantz Fanon, where these are people who, like, they grow up and they're told their only option in life to have any hope in the world of having a life is by adopting their oppressor's language and culture. And of course they're going to do it. Like, they aren't like a traitor for doing so. They need to do it to survive. CLR James did this as well. Now, at the end of high school, he initially, in his life, so this, we're thinking like 1910s, the late 1910s, he initially had little interest in politics, preferring instead to spend his time playing cricket and reading literature, like European literature. So he would remain somewhat apolitical until his late 20s, until the 1930s, when he became interested in the Trinidadian Tobago leader, Andrew Cipriani. and he was Cipriani was a European heritage guy, but he was a lefty. Like, he believed in working class stuff, unions. I mean, he's just like kind of a lefty lib type person. Now, at the time, the cracks and limits of British European communism became apparent to black visitors in Britain, like James, where Marxism was becoming more and more detached, in his view, from workers and more attached to intellectuals and wealthy socialists. And this is, for him, it really bothered him because, and Richard Wright will kind of think about it in similar terms, where he's like, Marxists like to kind of speak on behalf of people, like the working class. Marxists love to be like, we are the working class, so we can speak for the working class, which often means that they don't really speak to real working class people. And so, which I'm always like, I find so fascinating, because if you actually speak to like working class people, I mean, these are where I've always lived. It's like, none of them are sitting around citing Marx or imagining post-capitalist futures, even though that might be like what a Marxist might say. It's like what they actually need or something. It's like, but shouldn't we actually listen to what their experiences are and, talk with these people? And almost no one, in my experience, and there's a lot of it, is going to be sitting there citing Marx as like what needs to happen. They're just like, I wish I was being paid a little more so I could afford rent. These are the things. And while I think that obviously there's more to it than that, there's this kind of like, there are these stubborn strains of Marxist thought that just insist on being like, let me tell you what you need, stupid worker. Let me tell you what you need. Us intellectual Marxists, we've read all the books. We will tell you what you need, which I just find so infantilizing. But let me add, like, capitalism does that too. Like, they're doing that exact same thing. Like, and they're giving out pennies like for it. It's not like Marxists are the ones that are the most guilty ones of this. Obviously not. But it's an annoying thing that it's like, it should be remedied. Also, CLR James was super disappointed with the fact that the Soviet Union was totally cool with trading, doing trade with Italy during its colonization or colonialism of Ethiopia, and the Third International's disbanding of the Trade Union Committee of Black Workers, because he was like, what is going on here? What is happening here? And this created a large divide between European and non-European visions of anti-oppressive struggles, where CLR James was like, is this movement just a white movement? Like, are the internationals, they're just for like white people, white Europeans, and they'll trade with colonizers, and they're totally fine with colonizers because of some reason? Or like how all the tankies who love Russia so much suddenly are super silent when Putin's inviting Netanyahu to attend like some award or some like athletic stupid thing. Like, they're all colonizers at the end of the day. Like, they're all colonizers, and they have to be recognized as such. But James wouldn't give up on Marxism entirely. He really liked Trotsky, the idea of permanent revolution and perpetual revolution and just like constant struggle, and to expand the limits of this thought. He really liked Trotsky for that. And he also, like, his own version, James's own version of communism would be informed by Trotsky and actually working and living with working class people in Britain. And like I mentioned before, he loved cricket. I've never played cricket. I'd love to try it. Anyone in Montreal know how to play cricket? Want to teach me how to play cricket? I'd love to try it. It looks fun. It's a good time. But his interest in cricket would actually change a bit in the 1930s, because he recognized the way in which cricket was being adopted by and absorbed by the upper classes, where cricket before then was like historically very much like a working class and poor person's game, which is the case for many games. And it would then be seen as like a good source of profit, and the capitalist, middle class, bourgeois people would take it up. But this would kind of reframe his view of like sport and stuff, when he realized that although it was originally a lower class sport, it had been appropriated by the bourgeois to invest it with the rules of class, moral values, and a utilitarian rationalism, And all of this for him, he was like, oh, I see like the influence of capitalist exploitation and appropriation on these things, and how analyzing culture in these ways, something like cricket, is very illustrative, and it really reveals the effects of colonialism and capitalism on these things. Now, with all these cases, and with all, recognizing even the limits of like the Soviet Union's resistive struggles, CLR James started to expand his own view of what resistive politics would look like, and to expand it beyond those offered through Europeans and through European resistive traditions. And he became interested in local black resistance efforts, local, just like in the many different forms it was taking, in people meeting the struggles that they're experiencing in their own way. Now, and like, this is partly why I find the choice to write about Du Bois and CLR James kind of interesting that Robinson did. I mean, I'm like, also like, where are the women? You know, where are the women that were so instrumental to this black radical tradition? And it's like, come on, dude. Like, yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois, CLR James, you know, they're great, but like, these are also like middle class intelligentsia people. And again, he's Robinson's clear about that, but still, like, what? Okay, write about other people. Like, so many other examples. But in any case, like, obviously James's politics weren't perfect. Like, he obviously not. Just like Du Bois's idea of the talented tenth. You know, that just the small portion of black people that have to guide the other uneducated black folks. But he was like, James would obviously adopt Marx and Engels. Like, he would still like think through these things, but he believed that all revolutions really only began because their leaders got to enjoy the colonial cultures, got to adopt their knowledge systems, and then use that against the colonizers. Which is just to say that it takes kind of European knowledge to oppose Europe, which is one of the tricks of European colonialism. It's really clever, actually, is that it's like forces people to adopt European ideas to oppose it. Now, his split with Trotsky and the Internationals, it would really be solidified with his writing this book called Notes on Dialectics. And it adopts Hegel's view from the science of logic to advocate for a kind of true boots-on-the-ground approach and organic worker resistance to the bureaucratic movements embodied in, like, Stalinism, for example, where he thought that it was the people and not these bureaucratic responses to capitalism that would be the ultimate solution. Now, if you're hearing this and you're like, is this guy really citing like Hegel to think through his own brand of resistance? Like, yeah, and that's a problem. Like, I think that's a problem. Hegel was racist as hell. Like, if you read the Phenomenology of Spirit, the way, like, Hegel's just racist. Hegel just believed that black people don't have history. And it's ironic. And I'm like, yeah, Robinson, like, CLR James is not the best example of the black radical tradition. But in any case, like, CLR James is really important, like, thinking through the limits of Marxist thought. He went through this, he like adopted Marxism, found its limits, recognized the problems with it, how it wasn't actually accounting for black resistance and black movements, and how, like, the needs of black people and other racially marginalized groups. But still, like, there are limits here with his own class position, his own use of European knowledge systems to call attention to this, when there's these entire histories of the black radical tradition he could be pulling from instead. But yeah, I mean, that's CLR James and Robinson's view of CLR James. And that puts us here into chapter 11, Richard Wright and the critique of class theory. So Richard Wright, obviously a famous writer, he wrote Native Son and wrote a bunch of other books that, you know, brilliant writer. But unlike Du Bois and James, Wright came from the lowest class. Like, he came from the black peasantry in the American South. Like, he wasn't a middle class dude at all. He wouldn't have the same privileges of going to the fanciest schools or anything like this. Now, he came to and left Marxism for very different reasons than CLR James and Du Bois. He understood that European racism was something unique and could not be reduced to the imperatives of capital, where he was just like, it has to be recognized in its historical specificity and not just reduced to, capitalist, the interests of capital. Now, regardless, he joined the American Communists in the early 30s until about the early 1940s. And he joined them because he thought that Marxist descriptions and diagnoses of capitalist exploitation would allow for alliances with black folks who endured similar, but obviously way more intense, types of exploitations. And I think that this is Workers of the World Unite. It implies that workers will come together in fighting against these mutual struggles, which he quickly realized that actually really wasn't the case. Now, in Robinson's words, the specter of a world proletariat, united and strong, black and white, fascinated Wright. He would quickly learn, though, that many of the organized Marxists abstracted the masses from daily life, leaving a formless blob of kind of latent revolutionary desire. So, like I mentioned before, the Marxists that he would become disenchanted with were just looking at the people as this homogenous mass. And he's and just speaking on their behalf, not recognizing the specific struggles that those people were experiencing, or like, and what is also absent from this book, I think, is also, and this is why whenever there's this kind of systematic exclusion of women, it always makes me just super suspicious. And I think that Robinson here is guilty of this, where the black radical tradition is itself not a homogenous thing, obviously, as we kind of talked about, but it would look very different and look very different in its opposition to capitalism for like women, where like black working women experience the world very differently than black working men. Black working women, like other women, often were the ones taking on so much other labor that within the history of Marxism has not been really historically recognized. Engels writes about this, but like for some reason, Marxists just after Engels like don't take that up all that much, where it's like, it just seems like their only focus is on exploited wage labor and not exploited like women's labor, like the whole care economy that keeps the world going, or like maintains households and raises children. Like this is all labor. It's all productive labor that isn't paid or recognized like at all. And this is like, so in this case, like women's struggle in fighting against patriarchy is fighting against that alongside fighting against capitalism. So women are like, see their enemy not only in capitalists, but they're also seeing their enemy in workers who expect of these women to perform this work for free in the household, which is often goes on. But that struggle is often disregarded, or it's just reduced to being part of a broader anti-capitalist struggle. When it's like, no, that's not the case, because we're seeing it being perpetuated by and really expected by, even people within the working classes. Now his novels, that is Richard Wright's novels, like Native Son, would capture his own conflicted feelings towards communism, where he would like, many of his characters, they're about like real people a lot of the time, and he would express through them like even their own anxieties about the Marxist movement as being, not for them, not for black people, really being for white people, in that black people's specific struggles weren't being understood there. And so Robinson highlights that Richard Wright's approach was to emphasize and really highlight and amplify like everyday people's voices, what those voices sound like, what those voices look like, the words they use in describing their own experiences, and how they aren't so neat in complying with a Marxist theoretical tradition. And again, the kind of specter of black nationalism here emerges, where it's like acknowledging the specificities of the oppression of black people and how that demands things that Marxists don't always agree with, like in the form of nationalism. And so, like, if you read Capital, what Marx essentially advocates for in the third volume of Capital, when he's talking about post-capitalist futures, Marx says, like, exploitation will still occur to some extent. Like, when he's talking about the state, or when he's talking about the proletariat taking over the means of production, he's not saying that everyone will just earn their money and then keep it for themselves. Like, he's talking about a world in which the creation of surplus will not be in the service of capital, but will be in the service of the people. And what that demands, and this is obviously a very good idea, I think, but what that demands is that people do work, so they reap the benefits of that in terms of their money and what they earn being put into the public fund for everybody. I'm just using terms that are just kind of intelligible to us, and I think make it easy to understand. Please bear with me if you're like a diehard Marxist and you're really, you're like really ready to pounce. Obviously, the terms he would use would have been different, but that is essentially what he's describing. He's just very clear that it's just that people will, the money that leaves them and goes into the form of government or in the proletariat, committees or whatever that are going to run things, means that not everybody earns all the money that they earn. But instead, some of it is going to go into the public good and deciding how to move the people forward, not just enriching the pockets of a few wealthy capitalists. But there's a problem here in that what if the needs of people are not all the same? And if you do not have an account of the specific needs of dealing with historical reparations, like for Black people or for other marginalized, historically oppressed groups, what will it mean then to live in a communist world if one is Black? Will it mean that you're going to be learning about Black history in communist schools? I mean, this is a question. Like, is it just going to be like learning about white history? Because that seems to be what Marx had in mind. Where Marx is like, we have to learn about the Greeks and the rich tradition of European history. And it's like, I don't know about that. And it's something that has to really be considered. And something that Richard Wright was very sensitive to and very cautious about. And interestingly, like it's these omissions among Marxists and communists that push Black people even further into their own like nationalist aspirations, where they're like, look, even the people who claim to be the most on our side are really not on our side. So what does that tell us about the needs that we have to fight against these kinds of oppressions? And that puts us here to the end, to chapter 12, titled Unending. Now, in this chapter, he does a lot of recap. I don't really feel the need to do that because it will take a while, and we've already just talked about it. So, So historically, Black resistances, they've not been really like the same, or they haven't really complied with Marx's belief that people will be absorbed into capitalism and therefore into Europe and European ideology. Black resistance has often repudiated both, turning away from them, like, for example, with the Maroon settlements we mentioned before in Jamaica and Haiti, etc., rather than towards them. Now, these communities like these, they really elevated Black consciousness in a way that differs from class consciousness. Now, he concludes here by highlighting the urgency of Black radical politics in the face of colonial powers, state violence, and rampant exploitation and diminishment of Black people's lives, the value of their lives. Whether the other oppositions generated from within Western society, Marxism, for example, will mature remains problematic. This is how he ends his book, is to say, like, I think that he really holds hope that Marxism will account for these things and will adapt in a way that moves with the Black radical tradition, acknowledges it, respects it, learns from it, and then you see the mingling of these different resistive movements coming together in opposing all of these kinds of oppressions, not just amplifying one of them, like economic-based oppression, which has to be dealt with, and it has to be dealt with, 50 years ago, but it's got hundreds of years ago, really. But it's just one of many, and these things have to come together to oppose all these oppressions. But yeah, that's more or less the book. I hope that this was informative. If there's anything I got wrong, I'd love to hear about it. And anything I left out, I'd love to hear about it. Again, I am no replacement for actually reading the book. This book just happens to be like kind of dense, tough to read. So I hope I was able to clarify it. But there's a lot of the history here that I couldn't get through because it would take forever. But yeah, if you like what I did, you can like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. Who knows, they might get a kick out of it. That's always my catchphrase for that. I don't know why. Just tell your friends. I don't know. Share it on your things. But yeah, on that note, hope you're all well. See you next time. Take care.